Hello everyone and welcome to the Rangers Relay. My name is Cameron Beale of Heart and Hand, the Rangers podcast, and I'm very pleased to be joining you in our season review, and I could not do that unless I had my partner in crime, very good friend from Four Lads Had a Dream, Stevie Clifford. Stevie, thank you so much for joining me on what I think will be an interesting journey. We were talking before we came on air about looking through the various sections of the season as it goes. May not be incredibly popular, this pod, because of how the season obviously finished, but we will do what we can to try and make it as entertaining as we can.
Yeah, first of all, good evening and hello, good afternoon, whenever we're listening to everyone. Cammy, it's a joy to be here. We've not had the season I think we all wanted, but we can't do a monthly or a kind of regular podcast and then just ignore it when it gets to the end of the season, unfortunately. So I'm happy to be here, and there should be, even though there's not positivity around some bits of last season, there's certainly positivity heading into the summer, I think, and where the club's going. So we'll cover the nitty gritty of everything, I think.
Yeah, we will. And listen, Stevie, I think it's been interesting. I think is certainly our first season doing this kind of collab between Heart and Hand and Four Lads. Our friendship. To one side just for a second, it's been great to be able to try and talk to a regular contributor, someone who's been so actively involved within fan media at Rangers across the course of this season. And I think, if I'm being honest with you, looking back in some of the shows that we've done across the course, certainly of the last 6 to 7 months, etc., we have tried to be optimistic. Obviously, we would all want the results to have turned out differently, very differently in some cases. But we have tried to maintain an air of optimism and just trying to keep your chin up and stuff as well. It hasn't been great, but at the same point, we realise that it's really important for us to not bask in the negativity of it. We need to be able to try and highlight that, but I don't think it's the be all and end all of the season. I think you're absolutely right. There is definitely some real positives coming our way pretty soon.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that people listen would rather we were honest than we sugar-coated stuff or we gave a false opinion, and we're naturally quite positive people anyway. So obviously, when it comes to our team, we're going to try and talk it up, and we're going to think positively about what we're about to see or whatever. So I would rather we were like that than people come on and hear a dull, dreary podcast. So I think we'll continue to be positive. I certainly feel positive right now. We've had some good news in recent weeks, so I'm looking forward to what's coming. And I always think it's also nice to kind of have a look back on the season and the good and the bad from it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, if you're still with us, and then we will get kicked off. Stevie, we went into the summer with the bittersweet memories of Seville, a wonderful trip, a wonderful experience, pipped at the post, a terrible way to lose a cup final. However, we, as we always do, we started to regroup. We looked towards a summer where we knew that there was going to have to be some changes from the playing staff, and we made a number of key signings. John Souttar, Antonio Cholak, Tom Lawrence, Rabbi Matondo, Milik Tillman, Ben Davies, Ridvan Yilmaz all came in. And front to back, with the exception of the goalkeeper, given the fact that Alan McGregor had decided to stay after being given a degree of a swan song in the Scottish Cup final win over Hearts, that felt to me like the spine of the team that got the revamp that was needed. Now, again, like I say, it's all great to sit here with the benefit of hindsight, but at the time, Steve, I was really, really excited by this. Souttar, I know, living through in West Lothian, I know a lot of Hearts fans, and they were disappointed and angry to lose John Souttar to ourselves. If you'll remember, at the time there was a fair bit of heat centred around him within that stage as well, about the fact that he had obviously left Tynecastle. Looking at those players on paper at the time, how were you feeling about those guys being able to come in? Were you excited about the hopefully the increase in tempo, the rise in standards that you were hoping to see from them at the time?
Yeah, it was. Absolutely not going to deny that. I think that, I remember when Ben Davies came in, I was really positive about him being left-sided and him being a good player. John Souttar we knew was coming. So Antonio Cholak as well, I thought he scored goals. Wherever he's been, he's going to be decent for us. I thought he led the line. He completely changed the game at Ibrox. So with that in mind, when he was at Malmo, when he came here, with all that in mind, I was positive. I seen Rabbi Matondo against West Ham very early doors, and I thought this boy was exciting. Redvan we had to wait a wee bit for, but naturally, we thought he was a bit more of a kind of project perhaps. But all in all, I mean, at the time, I can't really fault it. Naturally was positive. I was thinking as well, Cammy, that, you'll remember the early shows that we did. I was really positive. I thought that Van Bronckhorst had shown real promise towards the end of the season, especially in Old Firm games. The semi-final springs to mind. 1-1 draw at Parkhead. I thought, right, he's acclimatised to this. He's kind of getting there. The run in Europe meant that we had reason to believe that this team still had a wee bit about it, and I was positive. I don't think it would do anyone any good to sit and deny it, but I also think really quickly that began to change, and I don't think that's unfair to say that. But initially, over the summer, I thought, yeah, fine, absolutely. And I was very positive going into it. When we done our review predictions, there was no hesitation in me thinking that we would win this league and that we would possibly bag a cup. So, you always have the optimism of being a supporter in that. But I think it would be naive or perhaps foolhardy to sit here and say any different, to try and pretend. So, no, I was all in. And I was quite happy to be all in. There wasn't much trepidation. But, Cammy, that did change very quickly.
Yes, it did. It did, and as I say, we'll cover some of that in some detail shortly. Outgoings, Stevie, the big move obviously was Calvin Bassey for just shy of 20 million to Ajax. A deal which I think was done relatively quickly in terms of that. Obviously, Joe Aribo moved down south to Southampton. Some players who probably hadn't featured as much, so guys like Cedric Titton, etc., that left. Liam Balogun was eventually to move as well. As I say, some guys who I think had made a mixed level of contribution. Some had gone for some good sums. Some I think had realised that their futures were gonna lie elsewhere. I still look back on the Bassey piece of business to say I think that was us making the move at the right time. And as we have covered pretty extensively on some of our Rangers Relay shows across the course of the last few months, probably the road not travelled when we had a not dissimilar offer for Alfredo Morelos and made the decision to keep him. With Calvin Bassey, we decided to cash in on him.
Yeah, and I think it was correct. Although his loss would be somewhat felt the more the season went on, I think that it was definitely the right time. 23 million and rising was incredibly good money. So I've no complaints there. I understand where we are in the football world in terms of, mega money coming in like that. Even, when you talk about the kind of 10 million potential deal for Joe Aribo, 6 million in your hand kind of thing, which was seriously good money for somebody as well that was running out of contract. So the Morelos thing, I think we've covered extensively. We all would have maybe acted differently, and if we had the ability to know what we know now then. So it's a different kind of proposition. But I didn't disagree with that business. It's a great move for him. I didn't realise we would see him so quickly. But we definitely missed that. We missed that presence and pace and power. And I don't think we fully realised, I certainly didn't fully realise until it got to the kind of elite games just how much we really missed that. Because in Scotland, it can some way, you can get away with it at times against lesser opposition, no disrespect to anyone. But when it comes to the real elite, when it comes to your trips to Parkhead and that, it was very evident of what we were missing. So deals were good. I think, even in hindsight it's different because some haven't worked out and I think that's fair to say. But at the time, in and out goings, I didn't really have any complaints at all.
No, and I think, as I said about the road not travelled with Alfredo Morelos, there is probably a degree of regret on that. And I don't mean because of how obviously we know the season's gonna pan out as we talk about it, Stevie. I just mean from the perspective of within our player trading model, within our setup. And I think you're right. I think we do have to understand where there's going to be times where we have to cut our cloth accordingly when you get presented with sums of money like that. And in the big leagues, let's be honest, right, that's fairly bread and butter. I think it's big money in Holland, so I think it is a big investment. But I also think, given the, let's call it the allure of being able to sell players in a market of that level, I think that given the money that's obviously in our neighbours down south, it does turn their attention to us that there can be opportunities from Scotland to be able to get players that, let's face it, English top flight Premiership teams wouldn't worry too much about in terms of spending 20 odd million quid. So I think it from an overall marketplace perspective, I definitely think it gave us some positive signs on that. However, we crack on and the season kicks off through next to myself through in Livingston as Rangers, and I'm going to use this word very carefully, scraped to a 2-1 win over Livy. I really enjoy been able to get the season kicked off, Steve. It's probably one of my favourite times. I'm not going to pretend about the fact that, even now as we record this in the first week in June, whenever you're in the close season, I always have that Rangers shaped hole in my life. So I love getting the season back up and underway. You get to see these players who you brought in and get to see them in the flesh and all that. I despise friendlies. I don't think they mean anything. So when you start competitive fixtures again, I think that's absolutely great. However, we did struggle through the Tony Macaroni Arena, whatever it's called this week. And thanks really to probably some strong perseverance. The introduction of VAR was in the pipeline. It wasn't here yet, but obviously it was a discussion point for a number of people because there was obviously a lot of focus on it. An interesting start to the season, I think it's fair to say, Stevie, because as I say, we really had to dig in and fight for that. I hate talking about that park through at Livy. I've played on it. It is definitely an equaliser. But what I would say though is that we had to kind of grind out a result here, and it was really thanks to a Scott Arfield, introduction that he managed to score, and James Tavernier scored a wonder goal as well. We did struggle within this.
Yeah, we absolutely did. And when you look back on it, it's interesting because pre-season we had that really terrible trip. They looked very lacklustre when they played Sunderland. That game got stopped at half-time for the floodlight failure and stuff. And there was warning signs. But against West Ham, they kind of picked up a wee bit. They had a good result, 3-1 at home. So we were in a brighter kind of mood going into that Livingston game. We did not perform well. A really horrible first 45 minutes. We now know that John Souttar had a broken foot during all that. When he was trying to play, it was obviously extremely difficult. So that was because I remember Joe Newbley gave him a torrid time. Ironically chipped John McLaughlin for the first goal. And it just wasn't a good performance. And then we had a couple of home games which were fine. And in the balance, if you remember also, Cammy, we went away to Belgium to play in the Champions League, and we turned in an absolute stinker and got overturned by them 2-0 out there. And I thought that they were an extremely poor side. It turns out we got that back at home, but they went quite far in the Conference League and only lost the league in Belgium on the last day. So maybe it was slightly harder, but there was early signs there. And when you're in the middle of it, you don't really see them, or you don't want to see them because you want to keep positive. But when you look back and hindsight obviously, and how it went under Gio and stuff, there was massive signs even that early that we were struggling and we weren't up to our best. So yeah, Livingston sadly I think was a sign of things maybe not being quite right within the squad, and that kind of freshness and injection hadn't arrived yet, or wasn't going to arrive as it turned out.
Yeah, well, listen, as you've just mentioned, we are almost literally straight into Champions League action across the course of August. The big prize, Stevie, was obviously being able to qualify again for the Champions League. A fairly horrendous performance and a 2-0 defeat in Belgium against USG was overturned at Ibrox, as you rightly say, thanks to a 3-0 win with goals coming from Tav, Tony Cholak, and a wonderful goal by Malik Tillman. So 2 of the new signings already starting to contribute. We then go to PSV, beg your pardon. We are then drawn against PSV and draw 2-2 at Ibrox, and then across in Holland, a Tony Cholak winner gives us an overall result of 3-2 in aggregate. And Rangers, for the first time in far too long, are now back into the Champions League group stages. Stevie, there's been a big part to me around a validation of when we were able to get back into the Champions League. That felt like, through the journey, and, we're still talking about the journey, but there is a huge part of that where we wanted to get back into the proper stages of the Champions League. My overwhelming feeling at the time was not just the money, but the status of being able to get back into that tournament. And for me, it just started to bring home how far we had really come across certainly one of the darkest periods of our history.
Yeah, listen, Champions League qualification was huge. It was absolutely massive. In some ways, for Giovanni van Bronckhorst, it was a complete undoing of him, which we'll get to. But for Rangers, it was absolutely massive. I remember being frankly quite delirious the evening that we managed to win in PSV, because I didn't expect it. Luc de Jong up front had an absolute horror show, which we needed, and that stroke of luck. And then the high press, which Malik Tillman turned out to be very, very handy, managed to recover the ball, squares it for Tony Cholak. We were unlucky. I remember Tom Lawrence crashed the bar with an incredible effort as well. So
yeah,
it wasn't like we went over there and we just nicked it. We actually played some decent stuff at times. It really suited us, that kind of game. So we were good. The early signs under Tom Lawrence, Malik, things were starting to maybe say, right, okay. And then the Champions League group. And I was really naive because I thought we could do well here. I thought Napoli, Liverpool, Ajax, I thought we would do okay at home on the back of what we'd just done in Europe. It turned out that was completely wrong. We all know how it went, and it probably turned out, Cammy, for as brilliant as it was for the club, and we needed, I think that was a complete undoing of Giovanni van Bronckhorst, because it was just the squad cracked and crumbled. There was too many injuries, which were really critical, too many big injuries, and we just didn't manage to grasp the intensity of the midweek stuff, and then the Scottish game. We just never done it. And by the time the Champions League started, and then we went to Parkhead and sadly got an absolute hammering, 4-0, and then to go to Ajax 4-0, that really set Gio back, because there were so many questions. Even for me, I'm like, this can't continue, because the manner of the defeats were so harsh and so bad. There was just so much wrong with it. By the time that the Champions League home game against Liverpool came, I had sort of stated on the site and stuff that this needs to stop, and the only way it's going to stop is if we make that change. So I think that the Champions League, as fantastic as it was for everyone, and by the way, Gio, I think, deserves massive credit for what he done in Europe, taking us to that level and returning Rangers to where we are and stuff like that. Sadly for him, as brilliant as he's done to get us there, I think it cost him his job.
Yeah, it's interesting. We will come on to that, because we're obviously going to talk a little bit more about the domestic performance, but it's just sticking with the Champions League at the moment. It's something that you had mentioned there. I do not think for a single minute that you were alone in that optimism of when you saw the draw. I remember vividly at that time, probably, let's face it, right, we were absolutely drunk on the success of being able to get to Seville. And so we fancied ourselves, right? I'm not saying for a single minute that I knew people who were saying that, we'll top the group or blah, blah, what have you. But, as everybody does when they see the draw and then when it comes out for the first time. you start looking at the teams, you start looking at, the fixtures when they get announced, and what, what it could mean to play certain teams at certain times, and you start to look at the group phase. So you start to work out the permutations. I think everybody did that, Stevie, and I think everybody, certainly as I remember, said, I do think that we could achieve something. And again, we know it's not how it turned out, so there's no point rewriting history. But, there definitely was a confidence about us being able to try and go. I think, it was probably a fractional confidence, because we knew we were getting back into the top tier. However, we thought, well, we can perform well enough. We got some great results against Leipzig, against Dortmund, etc. Why would we worry about some of these teams that we can go and we can really impress against? I do agree that I think for a lot of fans, how we performed in Europe was the tide turning against Van Bronckhorst. We really struggled in terms of being able to step up our game. I don't know if it's players got overawed by the occasion, because again, it's the Champions League and the majority of them had played in a Europa League final very, very recently. But when you mention it, obviously the result against Ajax, and I think probably with it being so close to a 4-0 loss against Ajax, then the 4-0 loss against Celtic, 4-0 loss against Ajax, it just felt like we were just getting gubbed. And that's a really difficult thing for Rangers fans to accept, because it's absolutely not what we're used to. The turning point, I think, for me, Stevie, just on the Champions League, though, was Liverpool at home. Taking the lead with a Scott Arfield goal. And, Liverpool, a top-tier team, there's no doubt around it, with, multi-million-pound players, with, a wealth of them throughout their ranks. But then enter Mohamed Salah.
I think that was a big moment in that game as well, Cammy, because it was 2-1 at the time, and Liverpool brought on Robertson, Salah, Jota, and I think possibly maybe Milner was there was 4 that came on, and they were all top tier. And we responded by not making those changes to try and affect that. We made changes up front, and I think we threw on Alfredo and maybe a couple other. Like, it was a really attacking move, and subsequently he absolutely ripped us apart. Now, we did lose Goldson. I think we also lost Jack in that game, so there is context to it. But Gio didn't react to what was going on. In the press conference, there was a real anger, certainly among like the fan media kind of lads, and we were quite straight with Gio. I remember at the time he said he was shell-shocked and he had to try and process it. But I tried not to react to social media. I went home and I gave it another watch, and I was furious because it was just so wide open. There was times where we gave up. By the time Harvey Elliott had scored the last goal, McGregor was
we were done.
Yeah, we were standing. McGregor stand watching and stuff. So the whole thing, and at that point I said, if we don't remove him, then I think that it's going to get worse. Now, in the league at that point, there was a 2-point gap. The points that we'd dropped away to Hibs, and we'd also dropped at home to Livy, but had been countered by the fact that St Mirren had beaten Celtic. So the gap was 2. And then sadly, it just went. At that point, I think the whole belief in the squad, as well as the injuries taking their complete toll, I think the belief in the squad just went, and it didn't help having to finish, Ajax at home, Napoli away and stuff. None of that really helped. So it was a bit of a disastrous campaign, not only for the club, but I think it completely killed the manager stone dead. So yeah, we banked the money and everything's great from that point of view, but unfortunately from our point of view, club-wise, it really didn't work. But that Liverpool game for me was the end for Van Bronckhorst. There was no way going back.
Yeah, I think you got the sentiment. I think for me, it was definitely fans struggling to be able to believe in what he was doing. There was definite feeling around the lack of improvement, the lack of a design, of a blueprint. we talked about the horseshoe at the time, and it wasn't really working, and so I think fans started to get frustrated at what they had then felt was just a lack of ideas. And again, I think, and I do agree with you about the fact that we do have to acknowledge what Giovanni van Bronckhorst was able to succeed within Europe. But when the true test came, I think that there was a number of factors. You mentioned obviously some of the injuries in there. Totally agree with some of that, but that's going to be the story of the season, of course. But there's just a dip in morale. I just think that we got to a stage where it was so difficult for us to be able to motivate the players to be able to do it. I think Van Bronckhorst couldn't do it. Domestically, throughout the course of September and October, some decent wins, Stephen. I will say this in terms of being able to recover well against Celtic, that 4-0 game that we mentioned. Obviously, we have Dundee United at Ibrox. We go away to Tynecastle and turn them over, and what was a great performance. Another 4-0 win for us against St Mirren. A 2-1 win against Motherwell at Fir Park, and then this, for me, I think if you weren't sold on the idea of moving them by this stage, when we got to the 22nd of October, the game of a million crosses, Stevie, at Ibrox against Livingston, a 1-1 draw, the body language, I mean, maybe again, I'm keen to get your thoughts on it because it might just be me over exaggerating, but the body language to me of the players at that stage just screamed to me of they don't know what to do next, and they're not getting told what to do next, and I don't know which is worse.
Yeah, Livingston was particularly painful. I famously asked Van Bronckhorst something, infamously asked Van Bronckhorst something in the press conference, which we'll get to in a wee minute, but the outstanding memory of that game, as you said, was cross after cross after cross, passing it back and forward defence, down the wing, Barisic, cross, and it was painful. Lundstram does equalise. He then also misses a header, I think maybe about a minute later. Now, that day, Cammy, if memory is right, Celtic went to St Johnstone, and St Johnstone equalised in like 92 minutes. Celtic then won it with the last kick of the ball in 94. And in that point, if we had won and they had drawn, we would have went top. And it was a complete sliding door moment because obviously they won, we didn't, and we went 5 behind. Now, again, in the press conference, there was quite a lot of anger. And David asked him, first of all, on the performances and what he's going to do to fix it. And he said, if memory's right, he said that, it's down to the players and the players to work, etc., etc. And I then asked him, I said to him, do the players still believe in you and believe in your tactics? Because it doesn't look like they do. Now, this kind of shook Van Bronckhorst a wee bit. He kind of recoiled a wee bit. And in fairness, do you know what? It was maybe a question that was more hurt as a fan than it was as a journalistic kind of point of view. It was quite a raw question. So there's part of me that regrets it because Gio was a really nice guy. I don't think he deserved that, possibly, but also think at the time it needed to be asked. So that was the beginning of it for me. I think you've seen, like you say, I think it was the whole point that I just didn't see what we were trying to do. I didn't see that the players believed in it either, and that was a really difficult game. So by that point, Van Bronckhorst and my kind of any positivity I had behind him was completely gone.
Yeah, and I think, for me, I could see people, I could hear people still trying to defend them. And I think that the reason as to why this, the result to one side, right? Because in actual fact, when I think about this game, Stephen, I think about the feeling, the mood, music at the time. It wasn't around, we've dropped 2 points to Livingston. It wasn't, even at Almondvale, we struggled against Livingston, bogey team, none of that crap. That wasn't what it was. What it was that we had, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, but we just didn't have the plan B that was necessary. We're not going back to the Warburton era, of course, of, let's just do plan A better, but that's exactly what it felt like, because it was, left to middle to right to middle to left, let's put a cross in, Livingston, deal with it, and they just ate it up. They could deal with it all day long. And so you're never going to tell me, right? And you're right about the turnaround at McDermott Park, but you're never going to tell me, Stevie, that 5 points behind in the third week in October, the league's done, right? I absolutely do not subscribe to that. And I think most people felt that way as well. What they were more pissed off at was the manner of the draw and the performance and the lack of creation, the lack of, let's alter it, let's switch it, let's do something else. And it was strange. I mean, it was really strange in terms of why we just couldn't get over the line at that point. And I think for me, what I just remember so distinctly at the time was, if people weren't sold after the Champions League, they were sold now that he had to go.
Yeah, I think so. I think also, I think the players believed it as well. I think the players were done. I certainly don't think they were fit enough, which comes back to questions over the pre-season. There was a lot said about it at the time. There's a lot said afterwards, and fine well as I do, when Rangers are going through bad, there's always splits in dressing room and training, so there's always those stories. But there was a lot being said about what we didn't do in training, especially on the training camp abroad and stuff like that. That there was basically no running, there was no fitness. The players were complaining of that. So there was reference to it made. One of Ryan Jack's first press conferences after Michael Beale came in, he made reference to training and stuff like that, and that was quite. It wasn't confirmation as such, but you could clearly feel that the players certainly weren't enjoying it. So we didn't know that at the time, but by the time it came to his last week, Cammy, the games, St Johnstone 2-1 defeat, Hearts 1-0, St Mirren 1 each. By that point, I think we were all. I remember the game at St Mirren vividly because that was the last game before the World Cup split, and the atmosphere wasn't, we'll drop 2 points. The atmosphere was right. That should finally be it. He needs to go. And once you get there, there's no turning. That last week when he was in charge, the performance at St Johnstone, Tav did pull a goal back, but the performance overall was very grim. Hearts, we struggled by in the midweek game, and then, St Mirren just killed it completely. I do think at that point the correct decision was made and had to be made, and I think that those things you've talked about basically accumulated in his last week.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I suppose, finishing up on Gio, I think that, we wanted to get behind Van Bronckhorst. He was given, I think, more time than he should have been, which again is great when you're sitting here behind sight. But he was given more time than he should have been because he had credit in the bank from Seville. We've mentioned already, because obviously by this stage we're now starting to get a key level of injuries, which was pretty much commonplace throughout the course of the season. But by this point we were at a stage where I think we had that lack of invention. We had some of those those I'm not going to say protests, because I don't even believe that there were protests. I think that there was just a general lack of real steer and direction from anyone within the club about what we were supposed to be doing here. It just felt quite rudderless. And then when the decision, as you rightly say, was eventually coming, I don't know, and I don't know if anyone ever will know, but when Michael Beale is sitting having pints in the Loudon in the district for the 4-1 game against Aberdeen, it doesn't take much to have to start to draw lines. And obviously not long after Van Bronckhorst left, Michael Beale was appointed Rangers manager.
Yeah, I think unfortunately for Michael Beale, I think to be fair, what I would say is Michael Beale kept in contact with me, and I think I've said that a few times, and he'd always said that he was coming up, and he just needed a fixture where it worked. So the Aberdeen game was something he'd mentioned to me like a month in advance. So I don't think it didn't look good when it all transpired the way it is. So for people that already maybe had doubts about Michael Beale coming in, they instantly had something to grip onto, because regardless, Gio was still a bit of a favourite. With, despite how it went, he still had a groundswell of support in there. Maybe not as big as it was, but he still, delivered Scottish Cup, Seville, etc. People were still trying to kind of hang on to it a wee bit. So there was immediately for Michael Beale, as you said, those lines could be drawn, and I think even he would probably change that if he knew how it was turning out. I don't believe for a second that there was anything underhand or untoward in there from Beale's point of view. I don't think that the club, I don't think there was anything there. Certainly I can sit there in a position now that having asked those questions, I really don't believe it. But it would be naive, I think, not to think that people would obviously go to that. So it doesn't look good, or it didn't look good at the time. But see, at the same time, Cammy, I was pretty biased. I wanted Michael Beale to get the job, so it didn't bother me in the slightest. Even if something, even if he had come up and said, yeah, I do want to be back here, and he'd given the board something to think of, it's not ethically right and stuff. But at that point, Gio having gone, I was really all on board, and I really wanted Michael Beale in. So it's a fickle football fan, isn't it? I certainly felt like that. But I think, knowing Michael Beale, I think that he would definitely change that if he could.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think that, there's nothing much that could be done. I did not subscribe to the idea, Stevie. And I know that people said it at the time that, Beale being here was in poor taste, that, we don't do that. But again, I think it was just the general mood at the time of people were pissed off, they wanted change. And again, I think you've hit the nail on the head. If you didn't want Michael Beale as manager, then you now had a reason as to not have it because you felt it was in poor taste. I don't agree with any of that, if I'm being honest, and where we are. Stevie, before I pass over to you to talk about the new era under your BFF Michael Beale, I do want to talk a little bit, if I may, about something else that happened in October. Just before we got to the World Cup break, and that is obviously the introduction of VAR in Scotland. You and I are both referees. Again, like you say, it's been put under the microscope, I think it's fair to say. And given fans of certain clubs were very much of the belief that VAR was out to get them, and somehow they were still able to win a treble. So, maybe there's not so much belief in that conspiracy theory any longer. It has been quite amusing, I think, to be able to watch people fumble their way around being able to try and understand VAR, despite it having been down south for quite a wee while.
Yeah, and even what I think is funny is we've actually had this a couple of times in press conferences. Barry Robson a couple of weeks ago basically sat in a press conference and said, why is VAR not interfering or getting involved, intervening when Goldson and Duke had that kind of tugging episode outside the box? And it was David that actually said, they can't get involved because it was outside the box. And he went on a bit of a rant saying, look, does anyone in this room know the rules of VAR? And we were sitting there going, yeah, we do know the rules of VAR, but it's one of those ones where we all said it at the time. It was quite funny that none of us wanted to say, well, the three rules of VAR are there and they're quite obvious. And goal scoring opportunity, serious foul play, all goals will be checked. That's the three laws of VAR. And I think that highlights the point that the VAR's come in and people don't fully understand, despite the fact that it's broadcasted before most games, what VAR can do and what VAR can intervene. But I'm like you. Listen, I've seen a few decisions at VAR. You maybe think, right, there's been a couple involving the Kilmarnock one. I think they were playing St Johnstone, and there was a pretty blatant handball that I don't understand, and even don't understand it now. I don't think there's been many, for Rangers' point of view, that we haven't got or we haven't been given that I've thought either way. There's not been many against us, but that's quite obvious because teams don't really dominate. There's not really been much against us. There's been a few handball moments with Goldson, but when you look at them and look at the laws of the game, they're quite straightforward. And it's easy for us because I don't really get involved in the online stuff when it comes to that sort of thing. But for me, like, I just look at the laws of the game and say, right, okay, fine. So it's maybe different our viewpoint from, others. Like the old firm one at New Year with Golson. There was a logical explanation there that you could say whether you agreed or not was different, but you could say, right, well, that's the laws and that's the reasoning. So VAR for me, it's interesting though. I don't agree with it coming in at the point it did, because if it comes in the season, it should come in at the start. And the reason I bring that up is you look at Gio being at the point where he was. Now, when we went to Easter Road, even 4 games in, John Lundstrom was sent off and it was later rescinded. And everybody at the time, nobody thought it was a red card. And Colum very quickly ran and made a show and, red card out. And that changed that game. At 2-1, we were bossing it. And that suddenly became 10. It very quickly became 9. And then we conceded. But that was a hammer blow to Gio even that early. It meant we were constantly chasing even from that point. So VAR for him, he could point to and say we were quite unfortunate. So that's, albeit that's a very small point. I just think that if you get around the fixtures, it should have come in and been able to affect the whole year. That would be my only point. But I'm glad, listen, I'm on record, and I'll continue to say it. I'm glad VAR's here. I think the majority of the decisions they get right. It's particularly good for offsides, which, even if it's an inch or whatever, it's still off. It's off. So I think that it has been good, Cammy. Interested to hear your kind of overall thoughts on it, but I don't subscribe to the. I do think there's been a few decisions that are questionable and I don't really agree with, but overall, I think that it does benefit our game.
Listen, I agree too, right? And I think, as much as we like to have a laugh and a joke about, being referees and therefore, professionally hated, anything that can help referees, and no one is going to convince me that our referees do not need help. Anything that can get referees some degree of support, but also, and this is where we did miss the trick, in my opinion, is being able to try and educate football fans. Now, before people listen to this and go, well, I know what's what and stuff as well. I think what you beautifully demonstrated there, Stevie, is that in most instances where I've seen people argue with VAR, they're not arguing with VAR. They're arguing with a rule they don't like. And I'll, let you drop Michael Stewart's name in here for I know what the rule is. I just don't like, having to, concede that the rule exists and then therefore that's how we should do the game, and I'll just blame the technology. It's like anything, it's the user. So I think that there were always going to be mistakes. I think that's totally fine because it's a brand new system, it's brand new to the guys using it. So that's fine, right? So that's when you're going to encounter human error. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Nobody's infallible. I think we expect referees to be infallible at times, but that is not the case. But all that being said, where I think that the SFA missed a major trick was being able to try and do some more, I don't know what you want to call it, PR, education pieces, anything like that, where whether or not you engaged at a supporter level, a player level, a club level, however you wanted to do it, when you brought in this system, it had to be done across the whole board. I have not liked the depending on your stadium and in some cases not been able to have VAR implemented, but it's in use in other rounds of the same competition you're playing in. So again, it happened within the Scottish Cup where some games had VAR, some didn't. And to your point, Stevie, if you're a club that goes out of a tournament based on the fact that you either did or didn't have VAR because of where that game happens to be played, that becomes pretty nonsensical and it becomes a laughingstock. And what the SFA should have done, again, only in my opinion, but what they should have done is use that as an opportunity to say, look, we are going to educate the fans here. We're going to educate players in the clubs and Scottish football as a whole in order to say that this technology is bringing us into alignment with the rest of the major leagues in the world. And we'll never, ever close the gap financially. We'll never close the gap from a talent pool perspective. We'll never close the gap in an international scene. What we can do, however, is look to be progressive. And now we've finally caught up with it. We could have said, we've seen it in England. We've seen where there can be mistakes. We've seen where it's had to evolve and be able to do all that. So using those learnings, why not go and allow it to become the best version of itself. Sadly, we're in a goldfish bowl of absolute idiots who, for some reason, still maintain professional employment as pundits, as columnists, as Ginger Hearts rejects, where these guys will try and give their opinion on something that really they don't know anything about. So for me, it can definitely work. I think that we do have a really low standard of refereeing whilst they continue to be amateur. And as a result of that, we need to be able to give them as much help as we can. So therefore, I'm all for the system. It can get better and it should get better, and we need to give it time to get better. But I was encouraged being able to try and see it come in. And I think now, as you've seen, and all joking aside, because we don't really like talking about it, no one does if you're listening to this podcast, but if Celtic are going to claim that VAR gives Rangers or any other team a disadvantage, you can just simply turn around and say, well, you weren't saying that when you were winning trebles, so therefore your argument is null and void, as it usually is. So for me, I'm keen to see the next steps on it.
Yeah, I would agree. I as I say, I don't buy. There's always conspiracies in it, but I do not buy in or subscribe that. So I'm looking forward to that.
So Stevie, that's us. I would say midway through the season, kind of. We obviously had the unnatural break of the World Cup being played in the winter time because obviously it was across in Qatar. We'll do that. We'll pretty much wrap up there for this week's episode as we conclude probably the more painful parts of it, I think it's fair to say, with the finish of the Giovanni Van Bronckhorst tenure at Rangers. We will be back next week, however, as we then start to look into the beginning of the Michael Beale era. It's been great to be able to talk to you as pair, but again, like you say, we've got some real positives that we get a chance to delve into next week. I'm really looking forward to being able to come back together with you to do an honest review, but also then to start to look towards a brighter future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot to be positive. There's still a few painful moments, but I think that where we are now, compared with where we've been, there's a lot more to be positive. And not only will we look at Beale's tenure, we'll kind of talk a wee bit more about in depth about what's happening on and off the pitch, Cammy, because it's been massive off the pitch as well. So there's been a lot going on there, and I think that there's a lot of positivity surrounding where we're going and what's happening. So yeah, thank you everybody for listening and kind of sticking with it. Sometimes it can be therapeutic, sometimes it can be a difficult listen, but part one is done. Second part of the relay we're looking forward to, and it sets us up nicely, I think, for what is an exciting summer ahead. So thank you, Cammy. Much appreciated. Love speaking to you, mate. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Yep, absolutely, folks. As I say, we'll be back next week in the usual places where you get your pods. If you're missing your Rangers fix at the moment and you'd like to be able to hear and read loads more, you can jump on to Heart and Hand, the Rangers podcast. We have our Patreon site, patreon.com/Heart and Hand. And if you'd love to read more of Stevie's brilliant writings, head on over to Four Lads Had a Dream as well. Usual social media sites and stuff, no matter where you get your Rangers news. Because as I said before, we definitely have a big gap where Rangers would normally be occupying it. So jump on over there if you feel like you're missing out and stuff as well. You'll get some great content across there. Stevie, until next week, my friend, thank you again.
Yep, thank you, and thanks everybody for listening.